The Anderson family lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where freshly trimmed hedges and carefully tended lawns whispered of stability and calm. At first glance, their home seemed no different from the others, warm, welcoming, and unassuming. On the porch sat a rocking chair that creaked in the wind, a relic of simpler days when life felt unburdened by the complexities that now pressed down on them. Stephen Anderson, a man in his late 30s, was the epitome of a hard-working father. He wore his dedication like a badge of honor, juggling long hours at his sales job while still finding time to coach his 9-year-old daughter Emma's softball team. Emma was the light of his life, a bright, curious child with an infectious laugh that seemed to fill their home with a glow money couldn't buy. She was the kind of girl who left drawings on her parents' pillows, a small token of her endless love for them. His wife, Cheryl, was Emma's opposite in every way, reserved where Emma was exuberant, pragmatic where Emma was whimsical. Cheryl was a stay-at-home mom who once pursued a promising career in marketing. Somewhere along the way, though, she chose the path of domestic life, a decision Stephen had respected, even admired. Yet, over the years, Stephen noticed that the gleam in her eye, the passion that once defined her, had dimmed. Conversations at the dinner table grew shorter, more perfunctory, as if they were reciting lines from a well-rehearsed play. Their neighbor, Howard Grayson, was a fixture in the community. At 50, he had the kind of charm that lent him an air of authority, a seasoned charisma that belied the more mundane details of his life. Divorced with grown children who rarely visited, Howard was the self-proclaimed handyman of the neighborhood, often offering to fix leaky faucets or unclog gutters in exchange for a warm meal or a friendly chat. Emma adored him. He was like an eccentric uncle who told tall tales of his youth, stories that Stephen had always taken with a grain of salt. But if Stephen had learned anything in life, it was that facades, no matter how polished, often concealed the cracks beneath. The slow unraveling of the Andersons' life began in the most innocuous way, Cheryl's increased friendliness toward Howard. At first, Stephen dismissed it as neighborly goodwill. Cheryl would invite Howard over for coffee, sharing jokes and small talk in the kitchen while Stephen busied himself with chores. It was innocent enough, until it wasn't. Looking back, Stephen could pinpoint the exact moment doubt began to gnaw at him. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and he had returned home early from work. The house was unusually quiet, save for the faint hum of a television in the living room. He found Cheryl and Howard sitting close together on the couch, their laughter too comfortable, too familiar. Cheryl had quickly stood up, brushing crumbs from her lap, while Howard offered a jovial wave. "You're home early," Cheryl said, her voice strained, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "Surprise meeting cancelled," Stephen replied, studying her with the practiced eye of a man who sold lies for a living. "Howard was just leaving," she added quickly, almost too quickly. Howard flashed his signature grin. "Helping with the TV setup. These smart remotes, I tell you, they're a nightmare." Stephen had smiled politely, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. In the weeks that followed, Cheryl's behavior grew more erratic. She spent longer hours locked away in their bedroom, claiming she was organizing old photo albums or decluttering. Her phone, once a communal device left on kitchen counters, was now a permanent fixture in her hand or pocket. Stephen noticed how she angled the screen away from him, her laughter muted as she texted someone late into the night. Still, Stephen held his tongue. It wasn't in his nature to jump to conclusions. Cheryl had been his partner for over a decade, his confidant, the mother of his child. She deserved the benefit of the doubt, or so he told himself. Then came the day that shattered any illusions Stephen had held about his marriage. Emma was at school, and Stephen had taken a sick day, his body rebelling against weeks of stress and sleepless nights. He lay in bed, half listening to the rhythmic ticking of the clock, when a faint sound reached his ears, the creak of footsteps on the floorboards below. It was Cheryl's laughter, unmistakable in its softness, followed by the deep timbre of Howard's voice. Stephen's blood ran cold as he sat up, the sound of his pulse roaring in his ears. He told himself it couldn't be what it seemed. Cheryl wouldn't, she couldn't. Not here. Not in their home. But as he descended the stairs, the scene that met his eyes confirmed his worst fears. Cheryl and Howard stood in the kitchen, their faces inches apart, their hands brushing in a way that spoke of a closeness no amount of plausible deniability could mask. They didn't notice him at first, too engrossed in their whispered conversation. Stephen cleared his throat, and the two of them jolted apart as if struck by lightning. "Stephen," Cheryl stammered, her face flushing crimson. You're supposed to be at work." "I could say the same for you," Stephen replied evenly, his voice calm, though every nerve in his body screamed for confrontation. Howard, to his credit, looked sheepish, mumbling some excuse about needing to check a leaky pipe. Cheryl nodded quickly, clutching at the explanation like a lifeline. Stephen didn't press them. Not then. Instead, he watched as Howard left, his gait hurried, his shoulders hunched. Cheryl avoided Stephen's gaze, retreating to the bedroom under the pretense of folding laundry. That night, Stephen lay awake, his mind a storm of questions. Was he imagining things? Was this paranoia, or had the trust that bound his marriage truly been breached? Stephen decided he needed proof. He began observing Cheryl more closely, noting the way she dressed with unusual care on days Howard was scheduled to be around. He started coming home unannounced, finding excuses to interrupt their frequent coffee breaks. But no matter how hard he tried, Cheryl always managed to feign innocence, weaving half-truths into her explanations. Until the day Stephen arrived home and discovered a betrayal so brazen, so utterly unforgivable, that the thin thread of composure he clung to finally snapped. But that moment, the one that would redefine the course of his life, was only the beginning. Stephen's day had started like any other, a rushed goodbye to Emma as she darted off to catch the school bus, Cheryl busying herself with a list of errands she claimed would take her most of the day. He lingered for a moment in the driveway before heading to work, something about her demeanor nagging at him. Cheryl had kissed him on the cheek, a gesture that had once felt intimate but now seemed rote, as though she were fulfilling a duty rather than expressing affection. It was a slow day at the office. Calls went unanswered, emails trickled in sporadically, and the weight of Stephen's suspicions pressed heavier with each passing hour. By noon, the gnawing anxiety was too much. He called it quits early, telling his boss he was feeling under the weather. In truth, the pit in his stomach told him there was something he needed to see, something that couldn't wait. The house was eerily quiet when he arrived, the faint sound of the refrigerator humming the only indication of life within its walls. Cheryl's car was in the driveway, but there was no sign of her in the living room or kitchen. Stephen's footsteps echoed as he climbed the stairs, each creak of the wooden boards making his chest tighten. He froze outside Emma's room, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Inside, muffled voices carried through the thin wood, a mixture of Cheryl's laughter and the unmistakable gravelly tone of Howard's voice. Stephen's pulse quickened, his vision narrowing as a single thought crystallized in his mind. With a burst of force, he flung the door open, the sight before him searing into his memory like a brand. Cheryl and Howard scrambled to untangle themselves from the disheveled bed. The scene was chaos, Cheryl clutching a sheet to her chest, Howard stammering incoherently as he reached for his shirt. The room, Emma's room, was bathed in pale sunlight, a stark contrast to the dark reality of what Stephen was witnessing. For a moment, Stephen stood there, rooted to the spot. The betrayal hung in the air, tangible and suffocating. Then, without warning, the dam broke. He grabbed the nearest object, a wooden chair from Emma's desk, and swung it with a force he didn't know he possessed. The first blow caught Cheryl on the shoulder, sending her sprawling onto the floor with a cry of pain. "Stephen, stop!" Howard shouted, holding up his hands in a weak attempt at defense. But Stephen's rage was unstoppable. The chair came down again and again, splintering under the ferocity of his assault. Howard collapsed to the ground, clutching his ribs as he groaned in agony. The sound of Cheryl's screams finally penetrated the fog of Stephen's anger. He dropped the shattered remains of the chair, his chest heaving, his fists trembling. Red fluid trickled from a cut on Howard's forehead, pooling on the pale pink carpet. You're a monster," Cheryl sobbed, crawling toward Howard. Her words, intended as an insult, barely registered in Stephen's mind. "A monster," he spat, his voice hoarse. "Look around, Cheryl. This is your doing. In our daughter's bed." The weight of his words hung heavy, silencing her protests. Cheryl stared at him, her expression a mixture of defiance and fear. Minutes later, the wail of sirens filled the neighborhood. A neighbor had called the police, reporting the commotion. The officers who arrived found Stephen standing in the hallway, his knuckles raw, his face pale but resolute. Howard was rushed to the hospital, barely conscious, while Stephen was handcuffed and led out to a waiting patrol car. Cheryl trailed behind, her tear-streaked face a picture of devastation. The fallout was swift and brutal. Stephen spent a night in jail, charged with aggravated assault. The news spread quickly through their tight-knit neighborhood, turning the Andersons into the subject of whispered conversations and judgmental stares. Howard, it was reported, had sustained multiple fractures and internal injuries, leaving him reliant on a feeding tube for the foreseeable future. Despite the legal consequences, Stephen felt no remorse. His anger, his sense of betrayal, had numbed him to the repercussions of his actions. The days that followed were a blur of court appearances and strained conversations with lawyers. Cheryl refused to press charges, but Howard wasn't as forgiving. Stephen accepted the consequences with a stoic resignation, though the resentment simmering in his heart never abated. Divorce proceedings began soon after, the marriage disintegrating as swiftly as it had crumbled in that single, defining moment. Cheryl made no apologies, her allegiance to Howard becoming apparent as she visited him regularly during his recovery. Stephen's contempt for her deepened, but it was eclipsed by the ache of losing his family, his daughter. Emma, unaware of the full extent of the events, asked endless questions about why her parents no longer lived together. Stephen struggled to find the words, torn between protecting her innocence and his need to expose the truth. Months passed, and Cheryl moved in with Howard, the two of them beginning a life together in the shadow of the chaos they had created. For Stephen, the house became a mausoleum of memories, a reminder of what he had lost, but also of what he had endured. Yet, amidst the wreckage, a flicker of hope began to take root. Stephen resolved to rebuild, to channel his pain into something constructive. He began attending therapy, peeling back the layers of his grief and anger to uncover the man he once was. In time, he found himself reconnecting with Emma, forging a bond that was unshakable despite the turbulence of their lives. Stephen's story was far from over. His path to redemption would be long and fraught with challenges, but he had taken the first steps toward healing, a journey that would ultimately define him far more than the betrayal that had sought to break him. The months that followed were a maelstrom of legal battles, emotional turmoil, and painful realizations. Stephen Anderson, once the embodiment of stability and control, found himself adrift in a sea of consequences. The court case for the assault loomed over him, a constant reminder of the impulsive fury that had consumed him that fateful afternoon. His lawyer assured him they could avoid jail time, given the circumstances and Cheryl's decision not to press charges, but Stephen's focus was elsewhere. Emma. His daughter had become the anchor tethering him to a sense of purpose. While he grappled with the loss of his marriage and the upheaval of his life, his priority remained clear, ensuring Emma felt loved, protected, and as shielded as possible from the ugliness that had seeped into their lives. Yet, every interaction with her carried the sting of Cheryl's betrayal. How could he explain why her mother no longer lived with them? How could he answer the inevitable questions without shattering her image of the family they once were? At first, Cheryl had tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, arranging visits with Emma at neutral locations, parks, libraries, even the occasional restaurant. But as time passed and Cheryl's relationship with Howard became more public, these meetings grew increasingly strained. Stephen couldn't look at her without a surge of resentment. Every glance between Cheryl and Howard at a drop-off felt like a fresh wound. Worse, Emma started asking questions. "Why doesn't Mommy live with us anymore?" she asked one evening, her voice small, hesitant. Stephen paused mid-bite, the fork trembling in his hand. He set it down carefully, meeting Emma's wide, searching eyes. "Mommy and we just couldn't live together anymore," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "But we both love you very much, and that will never change." Emma nodded, her brow furrowing. "Does she live with Mr. Grayson now? I saw his truck at her new house." Stephen's heart sank. He had no idea how much Emma had observed or overheard, and the thought of her piecing things together filled him with dread. "She does," he admitted, his voice tight. "They're friends." Emma didn't say anything else, but her silence was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Stephen felt his chest tighten, knowing the questions wouldn't stop there. The divorce itself was a brutal process, not because of contested assets. Stephen had little interest in fighting for material things, but because of the emotional toll. Cheryl's lawyer argued for shared custody of Emma, while Stephen's lawyer pushed for primary custody, citing the stability of the home environment Stephen could provide. The courtroom exchanges were tense, laden with subtle accusations and pointed remarks. Stephen couldn't suppress the bitter satisfaction he felt when the judge ruled in his favor, granting him primary custody of Emma while Cheryl was allowed supervised visitation. It was a small victory in a battle he never wanted to fight, but it gave him a sense of purpose. His role as a father became his refuge, the one part of his identity he could still cling to. Meanwhile, Cheryl's life with Howard moved forward at a pace Stephen found both bewildering and infuriating. She seemed unfazed by the wreckage they had left behind, unapologetic in her decision to move in with Howard while Stephen struggled to pick up the pieces. Rumors circulated through the neighborhood, whispers of judgment and thinly veiled curiosity. Howard, once the affable handyman, now carried the stigma of being that guy, the man who had inserted himself into another family's life. For Stephen, the hardest moments were the quiet ones. The house, once filled with the hum of family life, now echoed with silence after Emma went to bed. The empty side of the bed where Cheryl once slept taunted him, a reminder of the life they had shared before it all fell apart. He couldn't escape the memories, Emma's laughter in the backyard, Cheryl's soft humming as she cooked dinner, the shared glances during late-night movies on the couch. Those memories felt like another life, one he no longer belonged to. But amidst the pain, Stephen found moments of clarity. Therapy, something he had initially resisted, became a lifeline. His therapist, Dr. Mallory, was a no-nonsense woman who didn't shy away from difficult truths. "You're angry, Stephen," she said during one session, her tone steady but firm. "And you have every right to be. But anger won't fix this. It won't make you a better father, and it won't make the betrayal hurt any less." "What will?" he asked, his voice raw. "Acceptance," she replied. "Not forgiveness, at least, not yet. But accepting that this happened, that you can't change it, and that the only control you have now is over how you move forward." Her words stuck with him, replaying in his mind during sleepless nights and quiet mornings. Slowly, Stephen began to focus less on what he had lost and more on what he could rebuild. He poured himself into his relationship with Emma, rediscovering the joy of simple moments, playing board games, helping her with school projects, cheering her on at softball games. He also found solace in reconnecting with old friends, people he had unintentionally drifted away from during the chaos of his marriage. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Stephen felt something shift within him. The anger, though still present, no longer consumed him. He thought of Cheryl and Howard, their choices, their betrayal. He thought of the life he was slowly piecing back together, one small victory at a time. And for the first time in months, Stephen allowed himself to hope. Hope that the future, though uncertain, could still hold something worth fighting for. Hope that he could find peace, not for Cheryl's sake, but for his own. The journey was far from over, but Stephen was learning to walk the path with his head held high, one step at a time. As Stephen's days began to find a semblance of routine, the sharp sting of betrayal dulled, replaced by a quiet resolve. He had settled into the rhythm of single fatherhood, mastering school drop-offs, bedtime stories, and everything in between. Emma was his world now, her laughter the balm that soothed his still raw wounds. Yet, no matter how much progress he made, reminders of his shattered past lingered like shadows in the corners of his mind. It was during one of Emma's softball games that Stephen first encountered Howard again. The sight of the man sitting beside Cheryl in the bleachers, his arm casually draped around her shoulders, reignited a flame of anger Stephen thought he had extinguished. Cheryl wore a bright smile, her laughter ringing out as if she had no care in the world. Howard looked thinner, frilier, his injuries from the incident had clearly taken their toll, but the smug expression on his face as he glanced Stephen's way was unmistakable. Stephen turned his focus to the field, determined not to let their presence derail his day. But the encounter stayed with him long after the game ended, feeding a bitterness he struggled to suppress. The weeks that followed brought more run-ins. Cheryl and Howard seemed to make it a point to attend every school event, every game, and every recital. Stephen's initial instinct was to avoid them entirely, but he soon realized he couldn't shield Emma from the reality of the situation. She adored her mother, and despite everything, Stephen knew he couldn't let his resentment poison Emma's relationship with her. But the strain showed. Emma, perceptive beyond her years, began to notice the tension that hung in the air whenever her parents were in the same room. "Daddy, do you hate Mommy?" she asked one night as Stephen tucked her into bed. The question hit him like a punch to the gut. Stephen hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "No, sweetheart," he said finally. "I don't hate her. I'm just, still upset about some things. But that doesn't change how much we both love you." Emma studied him for a moment, her young mind working through thoughts she couldn't fully articulate. "I wish we could all live together again," she said softly. Stephen's heart ached. "I know, Em. I wish things were different too." The conversation lingered with him, pushing him to reevaluate his approach. While he couldn't change the past, he realized he had to let go of some of his anger, not for Cheryl's sake, but for Emma's. It wasn't easy. Every interaction with Cheryl tested his patience. She often arrived late for her scheduled visits, breezing in with an air of nonchalance that Stephen found infuriating. Howard was a constant presence, hovering in the background like a shadow Stephen couldn't escape. But Stephen bit his tongue, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. The turning point came during a parent-teacher conference. Stephen and Cheryl were seated side by side, listening as Emma's teacher praised her for her creativity and enthusiasm. For a brief moment, the shared pride they felt in their daughter bridged the chasm between them. After the meeting, as they walked to their cars, Cheryl stopped him. "Stephen," she began hesitantly, "I know things between us are complicated. But I hope we can find a way to co-parent without so much tension. For Emma's sake." Stephen studied her, searching for sincerity in her eyes. He didn't trust her, not fully, but he couldn't deny that Emma deserved better than the Cold War her parents had been waging. "I'm willing to try," he said finally. "But it'll take time." Cheryl nodded, her expression softening. "That's all I'm asking." Though their relationship remained far from amicable, the conversation marked the beginning of a fragile truce. Stephen began to notice small changes, Cheryl arriving on time for visits, Howard keeping his distance during handoffs. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Stephen feel like progress was possible. Meanwhile, Stephen focused on his own healing. Therapy continued to be a cornerstone of his recovery, helping him process his emotions and learn to set boundaries. He also began to rebuild his social life, reconnecting with friends who offered support and encouragement. One evening, during a rare night out with a group of co-workers, Stephen met a woman named Lauren. She was warm, intelligent, and easy to talk to, a stark contrast to the cold detachment that had characterized the final years of his marriage. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Stephen found himself laughing without reservation. Lauren was a single mother herself, navigating her own challenges, and their shared experiences created an instant connection. They exchanged numbers that night, and while Stephen approached the possibility of a new relationship with caution, the thought of moving forward no longer felt so daunting. Still, his journey was far from linear. There were setbacks, moments when the weight of everything threatened to pull him under. On one particularly difficult night, Stephen found himself scrolling through old photos of his family, the memories simultaneously comforting and painful. But instead of succumbing to despair, he used the moment as a reminder of how far he'd come. Stephen also found strength in his role as a father. Every laugh, every hug, every shared moment with Emma reinforced his resolve to be the best parent he could be. He knew he couldn't shield her from every hardship, but he could teach her resilience, compassion, and the importance of love. And though the scars of betrayal would always remain, Stephen began to see them not as symbols of his pain, but as proof of his survival. He had weathered the storm, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, he faced it with a newfound sense of hope. His story wasn't over, it was just beginning. Stephen stood at the threshold of Cheryl's new home, the glow of the porch light casting long shadows behind him. His breath fogged in the icy air as Cheryl opened the door, her expression tight with unease. Inside, the faint sound of a television played in the background, and Stephen's eyes darted past her, locking onto Howard. The man sat on the couch, his arms still in a sling, his presence a deliberate intrusion into Stephen's peace. "What do you want, Cheryl?" Stephen's voice was low and steady, the kind of calm that came before a storm. "It's about Emma," she said, her tone faltering. "Howard and we think it's time we discuss custody. Shared custody isn't working, Stephen. She should be here full-time." Stephen's chest tightened as the words sank in, cutting through him like a blade. For a moment, he couldn't speak, the weight of her audacity rendering him silent. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, his voice trembling with controlled rage. You want custody? After everything you've done, everything you've put her through, you think you deserve to raise Emma? Howard stood, his movement slow and deliberate. We just want what's best for her, he said, his voice dripping with self-righteousness. A stable home. 2 parents who? Stable? Stephen barked, cutting him off. You call this stable? Sneaking behind my back, destroying my family, and now playing house in some twisted fantasy. You don't get to decide what's best for my daughter. You don't get to take her from me. Cheryl's face reddened, her composure slipping. Stephen, stop making this about you. Emma deserves to have both of her parents, not just you dictating everything. Howard's part of this now, whether you like it or not. Stephen's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. You've already taken everything else from me, Cheryl, he said, his voice quieter now but no less powerful. You won't take her. Not now. Not ever. Howard stepped closer, his expression hardening. Maybe the courts will decide that, Stephen. You've got a history of violence. That's not exactly what a judge looks for in a stable parent. Stephen's vision blurred with fury, but he held his ground. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. Instead, he took a step back, his face a mask of determination. Do what you have to do, Stephen said. File your papers, make your case. But let me tell you something, Emma knows where her home is. She knows who's been there for her, day in and day out. And no court, no lawyer, and certainly no coward hiding behind a woman's skirt will change that. Cheryl flinched at his words, but Howard's expression turned to stone. Stephen didn't care. He turned and walked away, the cold night air biting at his face as he made his way to his car. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the simmering anger he kept bottled up for Emma's sake. As he drove away, the road stretching endlessly before him, Stephen felt a shift within himself. This wasn't over, far from it. Cheryl and Howard had ignited a fire he didn't know he had, and he was prepared to fight for Emma with everything he had. They might have shattered his past, but they wouldn't touch his future. Emma was his light, his reason, his everything. And no one, not Cheryl, not Howard, not the system, would take her away. This time, Stephen wasn't just surviving. He was ready to win.